Fabiano Caruana against Magnus Carlsen. It's round 4 of Norway Chess. World's number 2 playing against world's number 1. And if Fabiano wins this game, he will be only 4 points behind Magnus Carlsen on the world ranking list. So this is a great opportunity for Fabiano to close in on Magnus. And there's no better moment to meet world's number 1, because Magnus had a very painful defeat in the previous round against Pragnananda. I covered it on the channel. Thanks for watching that video. If you haven't done yet, you should check it out, because you don't get to see Magnus Carlsen getting crushed very often in such a way. Anyway, first of all, apologies, because the light and maybe even the sound is not optimal. I'm still traveling, I'm on the road enjoying my holidays, but I would like to bring this game to you, my dear followers. So, if you haven't subscribed yet to the channel, please do that. And here we go. Fabiano is playing with the white pieces. Goes for 1 e4, not a surprise at all. And Magnus, after his very bad experience playing the Sicilian against Prague, he tries to play more solid with 1 e5. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, knight f6, the Italian opening, also not a surprise. And Fabi goes for d3, the solid line. Bishop c5, castling kingside, d6, c3, a6, pawn to a4, all standard. Bishop drops back to a7, and here, first interesting moment of the game, I would say, because just at the candidates tournament in Toronto, Fabiano Caruana had his position twice against Vidit and also against Gukesh. And in these games, he went for the setup with knight bd2 and h3. Here, he starts with the move h3, and after black also plays the useful waiting move h6, he now deviates from these games by playing the move bishop e3. This is kind of a standard plan, which I often teach my students who don't have a serious repertoire, but they want just to have a comfortable game out of the opening. Bring your bishop here to e3, because after bishop takes and f takes, well, you do have double pawns on the e file, but the main point is that you also do have an half open f file, so that the rook from f1 is nicely activated, and together with the bishop, it can exert pressure. There are a lot of ideas here for white trying to improve his position on the king side, including moves like queen to e1 and followed by queen g3 or queen h4, for instance. But at the highest level, we will see also that this double pawn sometimes in the long run may become a weakness. So, well, let's see how Magnus responds. He goes for bishop e6, so he wants to have a very solid position. Bishop takes, f takes, the position is almost symmetrical. Knight bd2, castling kingside, and here position is absolutely symmetrical. With only one open file, very likely at some point rooks are going to be exchanged against each other. At least that's what we would expect. Rook f2, so that after the move queen e7, white brings out the queen to b3, attacking the pawn on b7. Rook a b8, Magnus defends the pawn. Rook a f1, bringing the other rook into the game. It looks like white is a little bit more active here. That's at least what you may think. But black is still very rock solid. And Magnus comes up with the plan of knight d8. That knight on c6 wasn't doing much. And from d8, it's ready to come over to the king side. Important moment. So here in the game, Fabi decided to drop back with the queen to d1. Queen has done its job on b3, and hopefully at some point the queen can become active somewhere on the king side. But there is something to say for a move like a5. That's a very typical plan of grabbing more space, trying to fix that pawn on b7, and it will be harder for black to get in moves like b6 or b5, because it will lead to new pawn weaknesses on the queen side. So of course black doesn't have to move his b pawn, but then okay, it's also harder for both your rook and the knight to become active. Anyway, queen d1 played, and Magnus makes use of the chance here to play the move b5. Pawn takes, and well, here you see that there's no longer a rook on the a file. So in a lot of Ruy Lopez Spanish type of structures, white can be quite satisfied when the rook is on a1. But now the rooks are on the f file, and white is looking for different plans than playing on the queen side. He goes for knight h2. And after knight f7, his plan of Fabi here is the move knight g4. So that, let's say, if knights are going to be exchanged, all of a sudden white does look pretty active. Still, nothing is really bad here for black, but if someone is better, probably it's white. But rather than going for the exchange here by taking on g4, Magnus says he wants to keep the knights on the board and drops back to d7. That's a very interesting idea in my opinion, because he's actually saying that the knight on g4 does actually hinder the queen from reaching the king side, from where it can exert more threats against the black king. So the knight on g4 is not too great. And well, what is white's idea then instead? It seems like it's very difficult to further strengthen your potential on that side. Now, okay, there are various possible ways of playing, but the move played by Fabi, it's something I never really like. It's not bad. He played a move d4, and obviously he's hoping that pawns are going to be exchanged, and then white is having nice space advantage in the center. But there's absolutely no need to help white getting rid from that pawn on e3, and black instead just activates his position on the queen side by playing the move c5. And now you see that the pawn on d4, it's standing there, but no longer defends the pawn on e4. But because I really think that such a move has some long-term consequences regarding the double pawns on the e-file, queen e2 is played, and now Magnus is trying to seize the initiative by advancing the pawn to c4. That's a great move. The pawn is, even though it's not doing too much there, it's actually waiting for white to make a decision with the d-pawn. If the d-pawn is ever going to move, there are possibilities for a knight to come into the d3 square. So it's not very attractive from white's perspective to release the tension in the center. White decided to go back with a knight to h2. Knight comes back to f6. Knight to g4. Okay, here we see Fabi is actually satisfied with the repetition of moves. Magnus goes back with a knight to d7, once again knight to h2, but here Magnus really feels that, okay, he's not risking anything. If someone is better, it is probably black, and here it is rook a8, so it's actually black who's going to try to make use of the open a file, hoping to attack the pawn on b2 as soon as possible. So white has to do something. Played here b3, pawn takes b3. And, well, of course you want to get rid of the pawn on b3 immediately. Knight takes b3 was played, but should be said though that after queen takes b5, there is rook fb8. And now here black is shifting the attention to the queen side with threat against the queen and a super strong pawn on b3, which can count on the support of the rooks. So anyway, after pawn takes b3, knight takes b3 was played. And here it is rook ac8. So black is not defending the pawn on b5, but hits the pawn on c3. Queen to d3, knight to f6. So putting pressure against the pawn on e4. But okay, the queen is relatively stable here on d3 still. What should be done now? Well, I think the knight on h2 is out of play. I mean, white was trying to get some play in on the king side, but probably you have to accept that you're slightly worse and bring your knight back into the position with knight f3. But here, knight d2 was played. Also, the knight on b3 though was not too great. But since the action is taking place on the queen side, it's probably better trying to move more pieces in that direction. Here, black played the move queen c7, attacking the pawn on c3. Queen takes pawn on b5. Queen takes c3, attacking the pawn on e3. But you're also threatening to take on d4. So it looks like black is about to win a pawn here. And okay, knight f3 is played, so you do create a bit of more pressure against the pawn on e5. So queen takes e3, d takes e5, pawn takes, knight takes. And okay, white is trying to simplify. It's 3 versus 3 on one wing. Still a lot of pieces on the board. But Magnus still is trying to make something out of this position with knight g5. Very interesting idea. Look at these knights. Knight takes e4 is an idea. Trying to win the pawn so that the rook on f2 is still pinned. Cannot be used at all. So white goes back with queen to d3. Offers the exchange of queens. And just one line, if you take on d3, which was not played by Magnus, you can win the pawn on e4, then everything is getting swapped. apart from the last rook, because there's rook to e1. You're attacking the knight, and if knight goes away, you play h4, knight goes again somewhere, and then e6 is hanging. So here you see that play is leading very quickly to a draw. But Magnus, once again, keeps the tension on the board with queen c5, so that the rook is still pinned. The knight on e5 is under pressure. Knight back to f3, offering the exchange of knights. But first, rook cd8, attacking the queen. And the queen can, of course, come back to e2. But it's passive, but probably doable for white to hold this. Queen to b1 played, keeping the pawn on e4 defended. Now, knight h5. So these knights, they're looking for action on the king side. Maybe knight g3 or knight f4 is an idea. If you take on g5, look at this. Black is going to take on d2 with tremendous pressure against that rook on f2. Shouldn't allow that as white. Queen c1 is played, offering the exchange of queens. Black is not interested. Played queen a7. And here still, taking on g5 was not played, but it's just to illustrate that Magnus is looking for amazing tactical ideas, because after knight takes g5, the key shot is rook takes rook, rook takes back, and rather than taking the knight on g5, you do play here this insane move, knight f4. The knight cannot be taken, of course, because of the pin, and in the meantime, you're threatening a lot of things, including knight e2 check, winning the queen with a fork, or even knight d3, which is another fork. So, and also the knight on g5 is still hanging. So this looks really, really bad. But that's the reason why Magnus is trying to keep play in the position. And Fabi has a simple plan. He just offers the exchange of queens again. Queen b6, queen b1. Queen c5, queen c1, and now finally black avoids the next potential offer of queen exchanges with queen e7. And okay, I think objectively white should be able to neutralize the pressure, maybe move like king h2, but their followed knight takes g5. Very understandable. When there's so much tension between possible exchanges, you want to release it as a defender. So rook takes rook, rook takes, queen takes g5. So here the knight on d2 is pinned, cannot move, therefore queen to c3, keeping the knight defended with both your queen and rook. Knight to g3. There are tactics in the air. King to h2 played. And now look at this. Rook takes d2, guys. Brilliant ideas. So that if you take with the rook, there is knight to f1. And after king g1, it is knight takes d2. And you are a full piece up. If you take in the other way with your queen, then of course queens are coming off the board. And the same knight fork is applicable here. King g1, knight takes d2. Black is a full piece up. So this was of course not missed by Fabi. His intended reaction is queen takes g3. So that after rook takes f2, you got to take back with the queen. Magnus had calculated further with the move queen e5. He sets up a double attack against the queen and the pawn. And so that after king g1, queen takes e4, black is a pawn up in an endgame. Still, these endgames, they have a very high drawing tendency because a queen is a very good piece trying to set up a perpetual check, trying to harass the opponent's king. But for now, the black king is absolutely safe still. Queen a7, and black is trying to make some progress. First, by advancing this pawn to h5. This is a very important move, and soon we will see why. Queen e7 played, queen check on e1, king h2, queen e5, centralizing the queen, king g1, and here it is, king to h7. So of course the black king is also very important, tries to become more active in the near future. Queen e8, and now the pawn comes to h4. So one of black's ideas here is to set up potential ideas against the white king, so that you always have the check, perpetual check mechanisms. Not that you're playing for a draw, but you see that the white king is in serious trouble anytime. So queen e7, queen checked on d4, king h1, queen a1, king h2, queen f6, trying to force the white queen to move. Queen goes to e8, and now it is king h6. So here we see that with the support of the black queen, the king is able to walk to the center. King g1 played, and now it is the move e5. You also got to use your extra pawn. Queen a4 played, and now it is queen f4. So the queen is offering now the exchange of pieces here Of course, the king and pawn endgame should be an easy win for black. Queen c6 check, king to g5, queen c7 attacking the pawn on g7, queen check on d4, king f1, and now you would probably expect just a move like g6 so that the pawn will not be captured, but Magnus shows some endgame class here by giving up that pawn. He played instead the move king f4, queen takes g7, and now it's king to e3. Beautiful idea, as you're threatening mate in one in this endgame. Also, giving a check on g5 is just wrong. Was not played, but I want to show you why it is wrong. If you now play queen f4, the exchange of queens is simply unavoidable. Queen takes, king takes, and because of that pawn on h4, these two pawns, they can barely move. King f2, e4, king e2, king e5. Your idea is to bring up your king and pawn, and at some point it will be zugzwang when the king is at the edge of the board, and then the g-pawn is forced to move, and you can always take the pawn, then avoiding stalemate ideas in the king and pawn endgame. Very, very important trick Magnus is making use of, which means that there's only one way to get out of the mating threat. That is king to g1, and now the pawn comes to e4. Queen h6 check, and now it's a counter check with king e2. Queen on d4 is giving a check, king h1, and the other pawn is now moving even further to e3, so that the queen on d4 is even defending the pawn on h4. Black is making a lot of progress here. Queen a6 played, king to f2, and here the position looks incredibly unpleasant, and at this point Fabi made the decisive mistake by playing the move king h2. What is his idea? Well, he of course has to deal with this problem of queen d1, queen g1 with checkmate, so that's why he moved the king to h2. But after this move e2, black is just one square away from queening the pawn, and Fabi resigned. Look at this, guys. You cannot give a check because the queen is beautifully placed. Also covers any potential checks from the white queen. If you do play queen a2, for instance, pinning the pawn, there is queen to d6 check, as that is now an available square. King h1, queen d1, king h2, queen g1 is checkmate. So beautiful technical display by Magnus, as in this queen endgame he used various assets, like he used his passed pawn, he utilized his king, and also the pawn on h4 is a very important weapon in this position. Well, let's just analyze the final position, because after the game Magnus even confessed that he was very surprised that this position is still a draw. He was thinking that he was already winning at this point, but the machine says that with a move like queen a2, and then if you do play e2, queen f7, white is still able to hold his position. Well, one possible variation, and there are many, but just to illustrate that the position is not winning yet, if you go queen to e1, king e1, sorry, the pawn cannot be promoted, so you can improve your queen, and if you try to go to d1, you can pin the pawn again. King d2, you give a check, and if you block with your queen at some point, then you can start giving checks from the other side. So the white queen is still quite flexible. If you go king c3, queen g5, king c2, you can give another check. So with checks and possible pins, you're preventing black from making further progress. I mean, in a practical game, when the players are low on time, anything can still happen, and the fact that Magnus thought that this position was actually winning already for him really shows that these queen endgames, they are very, very difficult to handle and even to understand. So even when I was analyzing this afterwards, I really didn't understand what was going on. Well, thanks for watching this game. At least this means that for now Magnus is still absolutely safe, retaining his world's #1 spot, making the gap a big wider with his nearest competitor for first place in the world ranking list. In the tournament though, still a lot of things are happening. More about that in future videos. Thanks for watching now. Do hit the subscribe button, give this video a like, share it among your friends, and if you like it, don't forget also to consider making us a PayPal donation via the link below this video. Thanks for tuning in, and see you soon again. Bye bye.